So welcome everyone to this webinar on supporting autistic people to flourish at home and beyond. Just to introduce myself, my name is Simon Williams and I'm the Director of Social Care Improvement and sort of head up the Care and Health Improvement Programme. And the first task I have is I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Councillor Hensman to you all. Now, Councillor Hensman has been a councillor for Braintree District Council for Braintree Central and Beccles Green since 2015. And it's fair to say he's a very active ward councillor in his own right and has been very active on local issues such as accessible public toilets and making sure that the environment is clean and litter free. Absolutely great, Andrew, to have you in your kind of role as a councillor, but we're particularly glad to have you with us because you've been a bit of a trailblazer in being very open about being someone with autism and being a very successful and valued councillor. And an edition of First, which is our local government association magazine, there is an article there about how Andrew has been on that journey, some of the challenges Andrew's faced, but what has been, I was particularly pleased to read about is how much Andrew is valued by his fellow councillors and his leader. You're clearly valued by your constituents, Andrew, because I voted you in again in 2019, and an absolute kind of inspiration to people that shows how with support people with all sorts of disabilities, including autism, can be in public life and how all sorts of people can become councillors. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you, Andrew, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Well, thank you, Simon. I don't think I need to do my introductions because you've pretty much done it all. But here goes. So welcome everyone to this webinar on considering and meeting the sensory needs of autistic people in housing. This report has been produced by the National Development Team for Inclusion, the NDTI, one of the LGA's key partners in developing support for councils to improve their support for autistic people. And we are delighted that Jill Corbin and Chris Memmott, who are associates from the NDTI, have agreed to tell us more about this report today. I'm particularly pleased that this report has been commissioned by the jointly managed LGA and ADAS Care and Health Improvement Programme, CHIP, because I'm autistic myself and recognise some of the sensory differences that Jill and Chris are going to tell you about. Well, I'm proud to be a councillor as an autistic person because I'm accepted for what I can contribute seeing beyond my autism, and I've had fantastic support in undertaking this role from Braintree District Council. This has made it possible for me to have become its vice chair this year, and just shows you what the right support can lead to for someone who is autistic like me. Who knows where it goes from here? Mention autism and many will think that it is limited to children. These children with autism grow up to be adults with autism. Recently, high-functioning adults have gained widespread publicity because the BBC has Chris Packham, ITV has Anne Hegarty, well, the LGA has me. And I'm immensely privileged to have been given this opportunity to be with you all today, coming a long way since I did my article with First Magazine 3 years ago. Can you believe it? My thanks therefore go to Rachel, Frankie and the team for working hard, supporting me behind the scenes, setting this up and then making this possible. No mean feat, I can tell you. Housing is one of my passions, and I have done a lot of work with Essex County Council on trying to help them understand the needs of autistic people locally. During this time, Essex County Council changed how it works and now takes an all-age approach in both their commissioning and partnership working, perhaps something others could learn from. I'm sure this report will be a fantastic addition to the information councils can draw on when developing housing. I'm really pleased the LGA is supporting this webinar just after the publication of the government's new national strategy for autistic children, young people and adults, which is the next 5-year strategy to follow on from the Autism Act 2009, a groundbreaking piece of legislation in itself. I know council staff will be working through the strategy at the moment, thinking how they can respond and improve life for autistic people. And this report, I'm sure, will help this work. As a mental health champion at Braintree District Council, I include all disabilities, there's your toilets, and especially neurological conditions like autism as part of this. So I look at hidden disabilities and visible disabilities because, as they say, not all disabilities are visible. To go off on a slight tangent, it is Encephalitis Awareness Week. The only reason I mention this is because its survivors present strikingly similarly to autism, and I hope that what we gain from today can be applied as easily to other neurological conditions like this as they will for autism. Now, before I hand over to Simon Williams from CHIP, I need to let you know that we have had a great deal of interest in this webinar, and so given the large numbers, we will be muting the audience with cameras off, please, whilst the presenters Jill and Chris tell you about the report. We'll have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, so do please add your questions to the question and answer chat option as we go along. We will circulate the presentation and the recording after the webinar, and we will also circulate a written up question and answer document if there are more questions asked than we can answer at the end of the webinar. We'll also have a short break before 3 p.m. and the webinar will last a maximum of 2 hours. So best I get on with it. So anyway, housekeeping over with. You'll be pleased to know that's it from me for now. Over to you, Simon, to tell us more about how this report came about and to introduce our amazing speakers. Simon.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So before I introduce Jill and Chris from NDTI, I'm going to say a little bit about why we in CHIP commissioned this work. What is CHIP, first of all? It's a Care and Health Improvement Programme, which is essentially managed by the LGA and ADAS and is designed to support local authorities in improving the way in which they deliver and commission support for people who draw on social care. And clearly within that, support in the area of learning disabilities and autism is a really, really important element. Why did we commission the work? Essentially because in recent years, a greater understanding of people with autism has emerged. And one of the most important findings is that most autistic people have sensory differences compared to most non-autistic people. If you're autistic, you may be oversensitive or undersensitive to specific sights, sounds, smells or textures. This can be positive, but can also cause distress or comfort. So we listen to autistic people and other people around how environments can add to their distress, and that when people moved into the community or lived in the community, not enough consideration was given to the impact of inappropriate environments on autistic people as they come out of hospital. So enabling autistic people to live well doesn't just mean improving environments in social care or hospital settings, but also considering a whole range of environments in everyday places. So an example would be, for example, a busy supermarket or other places where we would all normally go. And because councils are leaders in developing places and all kind of settings in which people kind of live, councils are really well placed to play a key role in making changes. And if I think of some examples about how houses are kind of designed in the first place, or how communal living may be designed, all of these things, if with good design right at the outset, can help to reduce or even eliminate distress that can be caused to people. So that's why we feel from CHIP, and because we are based within the Local Government Association, we felt it was particularly important to commission this work. It's also important to remember there's autistic people working for councillors, and we're really grateful to Andrew for agreeing to chair this webinar, and just need to remember that there's a lot more to do. So that's why our programme, CHIP, decided to commission this work, and I'm really now looking forward to hearing the results of the work from Jill and Chris. So I'm going to go on to introduce them now. Jill is an associate from the National Development Team for Inclusion, or NDTI, and has worked in involvement and advocacy for over 10 years. She's passionate about supporting people to know their rights and be involved in driving change. She's skilled in facilitating workshops and supporting participants to find solutions to barriers and try on new ways of working. Jill's most recent role was working as head of involvement at Brandon Trust, a not-for-profit provider, and here she co-produced and established an involvement framework and strategy to ensure the voice of people supported is heard in decisions throughout the organisation. Before that role in the Brandon Trust, Jill worked at Macmillan Cancer Support, facilitating carer and patient involvement in service review and redesign, and she partnered with community organisations to design and develop bespoke solutions to health inequalities. So it's great to have you with us, Jill. And then Chris is also an associate of NDTI and an expert by experience, who works on the Care Education and Treatment Review programme across the South East and South West. In his associate role, Chris uses his autistic lived experience to provide development support and highly skilled training to staff teams. He also undertakes environmental assessments of different healthcare settings and sits on a regional quality assurance board for 2 regions. Outside of his work with NDTI, Chris is also a national advisor, trainer and respite carer. He has an academic background in psychology and counselling and has worked for many years with struggling autistic people in both school and home. So Jill and Chris, without further ado, absolutely great to have you with us, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the introduction. I feel like I'm on This Is Your Life or something like that. It's don't usually get such a big intro, so really appreciate it, and thanks so much to the LGA, especially Simon. Thanks for the introduction. Rachel Carter really needs a mention for kind of coordinating and getting us this far, and Andrew. It's been a real pleasure working alongside you. So thanks so much for joining and partnering with us on this webinar. So I'm gonna, if I move us on to the next slide, please, Frankie. I'm just going to give a little bit of a background around how this bit of work came about, why NDTI were involved, and what our kind of relevant experiences. And then we're going to talk more about autism as a sensory and social processing difference, and link that specifically to housing and some kind of key and clear recommendations that I hope will be useful. So I'm going to start with kind of some of the background and how the autism programme developed at NDTI. So as Simon's introduction said, I really have a background in working with people with a learning disability, and I was supporting the Care and Treatment Review programme as part of Transforming Care. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but it's essentially it's a programme that reviews the care and treatment of people who are in hospital or at risk of admission, so those people who have a learning disability or are autistic. And the programme really started out as a learning disability programme, and we were supporting experts by experience across the South East and South West. And what we saw in the programme is a lot of people with learning disability were discharged from hospital, and we were seeing increasing numbers of autistic people being admitted and being recognised as needing additional support, or as being in hospital or at risk of admission. So my team sought to recruit some autistic experts by experience, and we found that some of those experts physically couldn't get into the hospitals because the sensory environment in hospital was so challenging. And we started asking questions like, well, why is that? Like, I'd never understood autism as a sensory processing difference. I always thought it was kind of behavioural. That's what I'd learned. And we got commissioned to do some sensory environment reviews in hospitals. So we started walking around the hospitals and finding out what is the environment like, what are the big challenges, are there any areas that work well, what practice can we share, and that work really really developed. So we've done a lot of inpatient sensory environment reviews. We've done a report with the CAMHS Mental Health Task Force called the Not Rocket Science report that collates that learning and looks at inpatient services. We've worked with the National Autism Team around sensory friendly wards and pulling out some key principles and recommendations for improving the sensory environment in hospitals. But we were really conscious that so much of our work was inpatient based, and we know from this work that hospitals are not good places for autistic people, and often people seem to be ending up in hospital because we imagine their housing was problematic for them or their support wasn't right. So we really wanted to support people to flourish at home, and we thought that we could bring some of the learning that we had from the sensory environments in hospitals into the community and develop this paper based around the experience of a lot of autistic people. So this is autistic led, so I'm autistic, Chris is autistic. We had a whole team of people who were involved in contributing to this paper, and a lot of people who participated and shared their experience, and we've included some quotes in this presentation. We also had some really brilliant contributions from some autistic artists. They're all credited at the end, and we're including links to the report where you can go and see all of the artwork and read the full report. So that's a little bit of background to how we got here. And this slide, I'm just gonna read out the comment from Ruth. So Ruth was one of the people who participated, and she said, being out in the world is frequently exhausting. So being able to come home to a space that's relaxing and reviving is essential to me. So we know, like for all of us, I think home is really, really important. And in the next slides, Chris is going to talk to us more about how for autistic people, we literally have a different sensory processing style. Like our experience of the world is literally different than for neurotypical people. So it's really, really important that we're aware of that difference and that we consider the sensory needs of autistic people. And we hope that this paper and this webinar will give you some hints and tips about how you can start to do that, how you can consider that in support, in planning, in design, in decor, and yeah, in daily life. So if we move on to the next slide, and I'll hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Jill, and hello, everyone. So you might be wondering why, if some of you have worked in autism for a long time, these ideas about sensory evaluations, about sensory being such a large thing is kind of new. And the answer for that is because, honestly, we only just realised how dramatically large a portion of autism it is. And that's because we put people into brain scanners. Here is a classic example where the brain on the left is a lady called Temple Grandin, pretty famous, and the brain on the right is a neurotypical lady whose name I don't know, I'm afraid. But their task was very simple. They were shown a picture and asked to describe what they see. Now, we can see just how different the response here is. And this is where we started to realise that autistic brains aren't broken in some way. It's not that some portion doesn't work. It's that there's an actual difference in brain design. The neurotypical brain on the right has a very clear motorway for social chit-chat, for engaging in conversation. And that means the rest of the brain is operating utterly smoothly. It means that traffic is going down that motorway for conversation very easily. Temple Grandin's brain, on the other hand, clearly doesn't have that motorway. What's happening with her? She's getting the same input she needs to put through that road, but it might be a little country road. It might be a footpath for all we know. Temple Grandin herself really struggles to speak. She has a very robotic voice and she can engage for only a few minutes at a time. What you can see happening there is overflow. And that the traffic can't get down her communication road well enough. So what's happening is it's going to just about every other portion of the brain and overloading it. She is somehow managing to process it, a process that she says is amazing that she can actually speak looking at this. But her brain is just overloaded. It's exhausted. It's using channels it shouldn't be using for communication. What that means is that she's on a timer. Her brain will quite literally overheat. Her brain will shut down. And we've realized that the autistic brain has this problem. A lot of the things the neurotypical brain can do, our brain is simply not set up to do. Our motorways are in different places. They're for different things. Anyone ever heard of special interests with autistic folk? The things we hyper-focus on? I mean, the classic one is trains, is maths and so on like that. I mean, that's a stereotype, don't get me wrong. It's not the case for everyone. But having a hyper-focus is a very autistic thing because those are our motorways. They're not necessarily the same as neurotypical. In fact, for those who have a similar brain setup to neurotypical, they usually don't get diagnosed. Because why on earth would they? They can engage in conversation, they can mimic behavior, they can do absolutely fine. And so if we move on to the next slide, please. I've had to try and explain this brain difference to so many people over the years, and I've come up with many different visual metaphors. I'm a very visual person. The one that's really stuck is roundabout theory. The idea of thinking of the brain as a series of roads and information being traffic. And the idea is, as I've just explained to you at the motorway, the autistic person has a brain that's set up very much as a specialist brain. It has a few motorways and lots of country roads. The neurotypical brain, the non-autistic brain, tends to have more of a generalist setup. It has kind of equal sized roads going everywhere, apart from maybe communication, which tends to be an important part of daily life. And what that means is they don't really specialize in things, but you put them into most jobs, you can train them up. You put them into most situations, they can do all right if they've got the base skills. An autistic person won't be able to do that because they might be being forced to utilize little country roads, little footpaths, something that physically cannot handle the traffic. If you don't utilize an autistic person's motorways, their brain gets overloaded. And what happens then is they can't process. And when they're then pushed into a corner, asked to do something they can't handle, or put in a situation they can't handle, they lash out, they shut down, they enter fight or flight response. And just so everyone's aware, it's fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and flop. The last two are often overlooked, but very, very relevant for autism. Fawn, as in fawning, wait, how do I explain fawn? As in sucking up to people, trying to, this is what I actually do myself. I go hyper social and talk my way out of a situation. I explain that I've got, say, a headache, that I've not slept very well, that I need to go somewhere. That is fawning. Flopping is when you just hit the ground. You're done. You've turned off basically. And that often gets noticed because obviously it's an issue. But things like fawning, things like just freezing, they don't get noticed as much. We've moved on to sensory processing. I think Jill's actually going to take over here, but thinking about the roundabout, imagine what happens if you've only got small country roads for an important sense like sound, like touch, like taste, like sight. What happens is you're absorbing so much from the environment that you've actually shut down portions of the brain. And this is very much what we're going to talk about today, especially in regards to the home environment.
Thanks, Chris. So as Chris says, autistic people literally have a sensory processing difference. And our 5 external senses, which are noted on the slide here, are commonly known. Our 3 internal senses are less well known, so they are vestibular, proprioception and interoception. Proprioception and vestibular is like our balance and knowing where our body is in space. Interoception is like the thing that tells us like, what am I feeling? Am I hot? Am I cold? Do I need the toilet? Am I thirsty? Am I angry? And what happens, this is a real generalization, but for a lot of autistic people, what happens is our external senses are hypersensitive. So we get some additional information or additional input from our external senses. So for me, it's really sound. I'm very sensitive to sound. I can't filter it out. I don't habituate. So if there's a sound in the background, like a lawnmower, for example, if my neighbours were cutting a hedge, something like that, cutting the lawn, whatever, I wouldn't be able to block that sound out. I wouldn't be able to filter it out, and I would continue to hear it. It would continue, using Chris's analogy, it would continue to add cars to my road. And what happens is that those external sensors seem very, very noisy, like they add a lot of traffic, and it drowns out my internal sensors. So I find it really hard to know what I'm feeling. I find it hard to know if I'm thirsty or if I'm hungry. If I'm overloaded or if I'm getting a lot of sensory input, then I find it really, really hard to eat. So generally, autistic people have a heightened sensitivity to their external senses and can struggle to hear our internal senses. So you might notice, for example, some people might be kind of quite wobbly on their feet. They might hold a wall. Chris is going to talk more about proprioception and kind of building layout a little bit later. But we might also kind of like cross our legs or like lean against things, or want weighted clothes or a weighted blanket, and that gives us additional feedback because we don't always know where our body is in space, and so we're really seeking that feedback about where our body is, and to support our placement in space and in the room. And Chris, I'm sure Chris would probably give this example later, so sorry for stealing your thunder, Chris, but he will always kind of hold the doorway as he goes through. He struggles to know where he is compared to the space around him, so we'll always kind of touch a wall or a doorway as he goes through it. So we've got this quote from Marion, and she said, "If I'm fighting sensory input, I don't have processing space to deal with anything else. I can't filter it out. Sensory input really matters. Not being able to adapt an environment means that I have sensory input that increases my stress levels." So again, neurotypical people generally can habituate, they can turn off, they can block out, they can filter. So that means, like, if there was a lawnmower next door, you might be able to stop listening to it. Whereas for autistic people, we don't habituate, we don't get used to it, and so we continue to hear or to notice that sensory input. And so it will really add to our stress levels. It will really add cars to the road, and that then delays other things. So, for example, if I have a lot of cars on my road and my roundabout is blocked, if somebody asks me a question, it's going to be 20 cars back. I'm not necessarily going to be able to engage or to know the answer. So the sensory environment will really, really impact our engagement with other people, our ability to work, our ability to have relationships, our ability to have social time, our ability to be able to engage verbally. All of those things can be really significantly impacted by the sensory environment, and being able to decompress and have that space at home to regulate can be so important to us when the outside world is unpredictable and noisy in so many ways. There's a couple of quotes here that I'll read out. "The timer on the cooker is triggering. It's not just annoying. It climbs into your soul and pulls it out," and that's from Emma. And Ruth said, "The most important element for me, and perhaps the hardest to get right, is for my home to be a quiet space." So I think the quote from Emma I included because I think it really demonstrates the impact that noise can have. It's not that it's an inconvenience. It's not that it's a kind of it'd be nice if. It really has a very significant emotional impact. And Ruth, I think was another good quote, because she's saying, this is so important and it's also so hard to get right. Particularly thinking about autistic people having a different sensing system, we will we'll pick up and we will experience different things than neurotypical people. So often when Chris and I are doing sensory environment reviews, we will walk around a building with people who have worked there or have used the space for a long time, and we'll notice things that people who use the space have never noticed before, or they won't have heard it. You know, they'll have filtered it out, they'll have blocked it out, and so they don't hear it anymore. But often it's like background humming noises. It's you know, it might be from lighting, or it might be the water in the pipes, or it might be from the heating or the forced air or the air conditioning. It's stuff that you know, that a lot of neurotypical people might not notice. So one of our recommendations in this report is to work with autistic people, because they literally have a different sensing system and will notice different things.
Literally, as Jules just said, I've had an experience in my life where we had a young child who for 80% of the year was absolute angel, went to school and no problems at all. But come Christmas time every single year turned into a kind of a hellion, just completely uncontrollable, nearly going into care because parents just couldn't handle, harming everyone. It's just going horrifically. And it's only for that 20% of the year. And they brought in psychologists, they thought everything they could possibly think of. And what they came up with in the end is to bring in an autistic person just as kind of a last ditch, what the hell is going on? And I went in and just pointed at the wall immediately and went, do you understand how loud your heating pipes are? And they went, what do you mean? And I said, well, seriously, the heating pipes are insanely loud. It's like it's shouting at me. And it turned out it was just that. The heating pipes came on, the child couldn't handle the noise, the child broke. That home environment had been ruined by a thing the parents didn't even notice, that they completely ignored. For me, it's baffling. I can't imagine how they ignored that because I couldn't focus during it. It's just different in perception. It's why it's so useful.
Thanks, Chris. Always welcome. We love these little stories. So what we sometimes hear is that autistic people have, for example, pulled the pipes off the walls, become very distressed when alarms go off, are upset by slamming doors. I was chatting to someone when we were developing this report, and they shared that they'd been chopping some vegetables for dinner, and that someone that they were with had come and grabbed the knife. And he said, you know, if that had been a residential or a hospital environment, that could have really been misunderstood as this person trying to cause harm. Actually, they were really distressed by the noise of the knife on the board, and I recognised that, and I was able to stop. So it's really about identifying what those auditory inputs are and thinking about how we can do different things. So with the heating, you know, Chris is often talks about his family negotiations around whether or not the heating's on. So being aware of it, acknowledging the impact that it can have on people, supporting choice and control. Underfloor heating, if you're doing new builds, underfloor heating tends to be a lot quieter, and there's some comments from an autistic architect in the paper relating to that. Some of it is about change in practice. So, you know, doors slamming, for example, can be really, really distressing. It's a you know, my colleague Richard describes it as being like a shotgun going off. And when we pull the doors too quietly, you know, it's actually that there hasn't been any cost with that. It hasn't required any changes. Sometimes like adjusting the hinges or putting a door arm on can help, but often it's noticing in those change in practice, or, you know, putting felt on the bottom of heavy furniture and that kind of thing can really reduce the noise. The other thing that we see causing a lot of problems is where there's a lot of hard surface. So again, this is particularly prevalent in inpatient services, but I think also in some kind of residential or other services where, you know, there's kind of infection control issues, or you know, places want to be easy to clean. But a lack of soft furnishings and carpet and heavy curtains means that the sound really bounces around a lot in a way that can be really, really distressing for people. So keeping that in mind, acoustic vinyl flooring can be good if it does need to be wiped clean. Sound absorbing panels can help. But additional soft furnishings can really make a difference and absorb some of the sound. So other things to think about is outside noise, including at different times of day. So thinking about the location of schools and shops and busy roads, again, that background noise that can be really, really difficult to tune out, or impossible actually to tune out. So the other thing that people who contributed to this report told us was that everyday noise from neighbours was incredibly distressing to them. And again, thinking about if people might be living in shared accommodation or in housing that isn't detached, this is something that's really important to be mindful of, particularly because people weren't talking about antisocial behaviour. They were just talking about everyday noise. The washing machine going on, the toilet flushing, the door closing, a phone call, an alarm, an electric toothbrush charging in the next room. I think 20% of people who participated in this report could hear electricity. So yeah, all of the people who contributed to this report said that they would really find it difficult to live with people that weren't family members or partners. So noise from other people, including staff, if the staff overnight, where are those staff based? What are they doing? And again, this, I'm not imagining that they're doing anything they shouldn't be doing, but if somebody is very, very sensitive to noise, then thinking about, tapping on a phone or a tablet or a laptop or watching TV or listening to music could be incredibly disruptive to somebody with auditory sensitivity. Cool. Okay, so vision and lighting. The two senses that people talked to us most about was hearing and vision, and lighting in particular can be incredibly challenging to autistic people. I'm just going to read this quote from Carly. A home with variable lighting is a major factor for me, being so light sensitive. I can go into shutdown if exposed to too much artificial light. This renders me almost catatonic and unable to speak, in a great deal of pain. I use a lot of small yellow lights and light bulbs. I also have in the past had a room painted black to help with sensory overload. I need to have a neutral paint scheme, with most things now beige or white. So that was from Carly. So yeah, lighting, so many of us are incredibly sensitive to lighting. I'm not. I work with colleagues that are, Chris being one of them. Fluorescent can be really, really challenging for a lot of autistic people. So many people can see the flicker. They also make noise sometimes. We are developing some guidance on LED lighting. So what we found is that actually that there isn't any clear guidance around how to get LED lighting right. So some of the standards are not very clear. Often the component parts are not of very good quality. They seem to be often put onto dimmer switches with the electrical signals cause it to make a noise and to flicker and deteriorate over time. So it is possible to get it right. And the things that I would encourage to get it as right as possible is user control. So avoiding automatic lights where possible, or where they're needed, also adding a switch that they can be turned off. Making sure that lights aren't connected on the same circuit as the extractor fans. So this is something that's really, really common in bathrooms. So the building regulations say that bathrooms do have to have an extractor fan, but they don't have to be on the same circuit as light. So it can be really, really helpful if it's possible to switch those off separately. The other thing to think about is shadows. So a changing light levels can be very, very difficult for some people to process. And can lead to real challenges with transitions and even avoidance of certain spaces. So trying to get clear and consistent lighting levels can be really, really helpful, and using natural light where possible. The other thing that, for those of you who've seen the report, a lot of people talk about is having smaller lights, side lights, fairy lights, candle lights. So being able to have much lower lighting levels, and again, user choice and control there, can be really beneficial. Okay, so connected to vision and lighting is decor. Again, this is something that a lot of people had very clear and definite views about. And there's this really lovely image from Tom Yates, who's one of the artists who contributed. So Rachel said clashing wallpaper can induce nausea and headaches. Conversely, pleasing colours do wonders. So I've worked with some colleagues before who really struggle to access space where there's patterns, and particularly patterns on floors. Excuse me. There's one building that I'm thinking of that has a swirly pattern on the floor in the reception. And some of my colleagues physically can't get into the building because they're worried that they're going to be drawn into a whirlpool or something like that. So plain and neutral colours and carpets and flooring, decor can be really, really helpful. The other thing that we really encourage is storage. So a lot of places have a lot of visual clutter. My office actually is quite a prime example of this at the moment. So where there's a lot of visual clutter, there's a lot to process, and often it needs to be processed every time that the space is accessed. And if one thing moves, it's like everything has to be processed again. Some of us also get quite drawn into patterns and absorbed in patterns and counting and that kind of thing, particularly if we're having a challenging time. So neutral furnishings, neutral furniture, and a plain and calm environment can make it a lot more accessible. There were a few people who contributed to the report who said actually they really like a busy wall or a busy environment, and we'd really encourage that personalisation, but in private space rather than in kind of hallways or access areas that a lot of people are going to pass. So we tend to say go neutral and calm and start from that neutral palette and then build and personalise from there. So I think we have got one more slide from Chris, and we're then going to have a break. So Chris, if I can pass over to you for this slide.
Certainly, thanks Jill. So as Jill mentioned earlier, I struggle with proprioception myself, and I need to make sure that everyone understands it doesn't mean things like hand-eye coordination. I was a national rugby player. I play tennis at a reasonably high level. I have good foot control for football and stuff. That's fine. It's about what happens when you're not paying a lot of attention. What happens when the brain is a bit overloaded or you're just not focusing and walking through somewhere, because that's where I lose track of my body entirely. For me, it's like I'm just a head floating along. I have no input on where my body is in that situation. So as Jill said, when I walk through a door, I have to touch the door frame. Otherwise I walk into it. There's a certain bit of wall in my house that I swear moves. It's broken my toe like 6 times. It's malicious. And yet I can't avoid it for some reason. I kick it like every other day because it sticks out a little bit more than I expect. So a big part of building a good autistic environment is making sure you have things like a clear line of travel. You don't have things that stick out. In our house, again, we don't have surfaces with sharp corners. Otherwise, we will walk into them and damage ourselves. It's just there's a thing that happens. So we have like curved surfaces, things like that. It's also having very delineated edges of things. You don't want, there needs to be no worry that you're about to walk into something. There needs to be no worry that you're about to touch something unexpectedly. The first CTR case I ever worked on, I worked with a young chap who was in a wheelchair most of the time. And he really just couldn't process the world outside of his wheelchair. To him, it was almost as if he was blind and the rest of the world was a white mess apart from his wheelchair. That's the only thing he could like see, feel, touch, taste. Everything else was outside. So he needed people to pass things in at a very specific height because it's the only way he could process it's coming in towards him. And if something fell off, say he's eating food and it fell off his lap onto the floor, it's gone now. He can't process it anymore. It's an extreme example of proprioception, but at the same time, it was missed by the care team. They thought it was about control, about rituals, about things like that, and they were really against it. And in reality, he just couldn't process the world outside that point. So building a room that makes sense to the individual is as important as it is to a blind person. We need to know where everything is. We need to be able to process it. Some people might like clutter. We have our hoarders. Autistic people have clutter everywhere. We have some people have their entire rooms built up 10 foot high somehow. It is about the individual. I would say in general, you want an open space that people can then fill. So go for a neutral open space people can fill, and make sure people are comfortable walking through it. It has good lines of sight and things like that. So much the same on this slide as the previous ones, to be honest. Thinking about the roads, thinking about traffic coming in, thinking about input. Important to note with smell, it truly doesn't matter if it's a good smell or bad. If you walk into my presence and you're wearing the world's most amazing perfume, or you could really do with a shower, both of them are going to be a lot of cars coming onto my road. If you consider just how many smells there are actually around you, probably on you at this time, you start to wonder just what people with a very sensitive sense of smell actually pick up from the world around them. We've got a quote here from Carly again. Certain smells can really help to calm and soothe me. On the contrary, other smells can make me feel quite unwell. For some autistic people, the sense of smell can be so strong that it feels like you're being force-fed. Now, I myself have nearly no sense of smell, unless it's extremely strong in one or two areas. So for me, I can't deal with citrus, which is an issue for nearly every cleaning product and quite a lot of the detergents, and basically means I can't enter public toilets or a lot of people's houses after they've been cleaned. If I was in hospital and they had to clean my room and I came back to that, I would no longer be able to enter that room. I know my colleague Jill has said when she's had cleaners around her house before, they've used something like a rhubarb scented cleaner, which meant she physically couldn't get into her own house until that smell went, which was, I think, days. I think I'm right in saying it's days later almost. So smell is incredibly important to think about. It's a flood of information through those roads. It's when one sense is overloaded, the first portion of the brain that tends to catch the traffic, that catches the overloaded traffic, is this communication portion of the brain. I forget the correct term, but the communication portion of the brain, social communication. You can't talk anymore. I will go non-verbal if I can't process my sensory information. I said sensory information like 12 times in a row there. Ignore that. Wonderful. Okay, touch. Much like with proprioception, it depends on the situation. Now, again, I played national rugby and I was a prop. So anyone that knows rugby knows I'm used to being groped just about all over the entire time. But I was ready for that. I accepted it as part of being part of the team, part of the sport. I could deal with that touching. If someone comes up to me in a corridor, in a workplace, and even just places a hand on my back to get my attention, it's like ice cubes down my spine. Everything else stops. It's the only impact that matters. I remember going into London once for a conference, and I sat down and on the train, and I sat down, and a very pretty young woman came and sat down next to me, which should be a great thing. Hello, maybe I can talk to her and get lucky. Who knows? Maybe I'll get her number. But no, because when she sat down, her knee touched mine, and I froze for the next hour and a half journey into London because my body had just utterly shut down. I had no input at that point because I had an unexpected touch. So be very, very careful with what is touching anyone. And that is just people. Consider at this moment what you have touching you, your body at this moment. Like, I'm assuming clothes. I'm hoping clothes personally. I'm assuming you're sitting on something or maybe lying down or something. Imagine if those fabrics that are touching you are unpleasant. Imagine if those are adding extra cars to your roads, how much processing you will lose just from having the wrong clothes on, just from having the wrong seat texture. How many places of a care environment, a home environment offer things like different bedding unless pushed for it? What if someone doesn't like the bedding they're using? What if it moves traffic onto the brain so their brain never really shuts off because it's always processing? If people can't sleep, they can't process, they can't progress. They can't become better versions of themselves. Touch is incredibly important. I remember we went around a hospital, Jill and myself, for a sensory assessment. And as we're going up the stairs, we both reached out for the banister. And it was what we thought was wood. But it turned out to be freezing cold metal that had been painted to look like wood. And both of us just stopped on that stair. It was an unpleasant moment. Like, it was very close to sending me out of the building. I was nearly done with that assessment because I had an unexpected, clammy, cold sensation on my hand where I wasn't expecting it. The flood of cars came very close to shutting down my entire brain, and I would have had to leave there for somewhere a lot quieter. So be very aware of what fabrics you're asking people to live with. For example, my parents bought a sofa that is absolutely wonderful for them. Only the issue is it's built for someone their size, which is half my size, so I can barely fit on it. And the second one is I can't deal with the texture. The fabric's wrong for me. So I've never touched that. I used to vegetate in front of the TV the entire time. Maybe it's a good thing I don't now. But like, I don't watch TV anymore because I can't sit on the sofa. I can't actually use that room basically now. So be very aware. What you need to do is you need to give choices. It's unique to each individual. There's no universal best fabric. There's no universal best texture. It is individual. And so you just need to offer choices. We're not very subtle. We'll go for what doesn't hurt. So if you offer us choices, we'll go to the textures that don't hurt. Be aware of things like tags in clothing, seams in clothing. I personally love bamboo socks, which is rare because I think socks are the devil's invention. I absolutely hate them. When I was younger, you used to have to fight to get me into socks. I can't stand them at all. But bamboo socks are pretty wonderful, especially ones that are loose enough that they're not constricting in any way, shape or form. I've had to have slip-on shoes. I could go on this subject for literally a day or two in a row. It's a major thing for me. Just be very aware. Like, give the choices, please. I beg you. Choices are good. We like choices.
Lovely. Okay, one for me. So, taste and eating. So we're really conscious that this presentation and this paper is really about the built environment, taste and eating. So obviously, taste is one of our external senses. And we tend to spend a lot of time in the work that we do talking about food and eating and particularly the dining environment. So often dining rooms are the most challenging sensory environments, perhaps second to bathrooms, which tend to be absolutely the worst. But dining rooms often, there's a lot of hard surfaces. Usually the chairs and tables don't have felt on the bottom, and they make a noise as they pull across the hard floor. Usually there is solid walls without very much soft furnishing. Usually there is a solid ceiling with some very bright overhead lights. Often there's not very good or much natural light. Sometimes the dining area is connected to the kitchen, either canteen style or part of a kind of kitchen dining area, which seems to be all the rage these days. Often there's a kind of a social expectation around food and eating. So, yeah, and so there's so much input, and like eating literally affects all of our senses. Like, it's our taste as we put the food into our mouth. It's our proprioception as we lift a fork to our mouth, assuming we're using cutlery, which I usually don't, but assuming we're using cutlery. It's like this proprioception as we bring the food to our mouth, and then there's the taste as it enters our mouth, and there's the sensation of the food inside, and you know, the kind of the way that it moves down through our bodies and sits inside us. There's usually a social demand. There's usually kind of pressure from the chair or the furniture. There's often the smell, there's the visuals. You know, there's often kind of background noise from fridges. You know, they're really a big challenge in my life, the noise of fridges. You know, some people have them in dining rooms, which baffles me because I can't switch off from the noise. And for a lot of us, there's additional challenges with eating. So some people that affects more extremely or less extremely. So I think Chris and I probably both identifying myself in kind of quite a minor way. Like if I'm stressed or if I have a lot going on, then I find it difficult to eat. Like I can get quite anxious, I can get quite uptight, and it can be really difficult for me to process food if I have other things going on. But for some people, it's a really significant factor. You know, for people who have sensitivity to taste and texture, they might have very definite preferences around what they want to eat or how they want to eat it, or how it should be cooked or how it should be set out on a plate. Now, add to that additional sensory demands, so bright lighting, smells, other people, noise from other people eating, social demands either from other people that we're supposed to eat with, or for those of us who need support from staff being around. Often in communal settings, there's often like a radio on or additional background noise, and it can be really overwhelming. And this is something that we're expected to do at least 3 times a day, and often in kind of social demands, often following another busy activity and before we do something else. So it's really worth considering how we can neutralise the sensory environment in dining rooms, and also how we can support people to have more choice and control. So there was a Brazilian research paper published that engaged a lot of autistic adults, and the very strong preference from most people was that they eat on their own. And this is something that Cos echoes. So Cos said, "I need to be able to eat away from other people. This isn't all the time, but if they're eating smelly food or making loud noises or eating with their mouth open, it makes me feel quite ill." Cos identifies as an autistic elder, and a lot of Cos's like focus and interest is on kind of care and support for older people, and supporting choice and control for autistic people as we get older. So one of the things, I hope I'm representing her fairly, but one of the things that I hear from Cos is, as we get older, so a lot of people missed a diagnosis because a diagnosis wasn't very common, and is until the 90s, if you didn't have a learning disability, you couldn't be identified as being autistic. A lot of people didn't meet the narrow stereotype, and so were not recognised as being autistic, and so they perhaps missed a diagnosis, or perhaps invisible in older age, and then moving into older people's services are often identified again as a generic group as being an older person, rather than having an additional identity such as being autistic. And so Cos, her the thing that Cos really brought to this is, how are we considering the needs of older people? How are we considering this when we're thinking about support for older people, and also thinking about kind of long-term home and support needs, and adjustments that we might need to the home and the environment to make sure that it's right for people as they get older. So yeah, dining rooms, really challenging. There are really straightforward, cheap, practical adjustments that we can make that make a really significant difference. Turning the lights off, felt on the bottom of seats, choice and control about when and where we eat, choice and control about what and how we eat, being able to eat alone, and also being able to predict, so knowing what I'm having and when, and being able to prepare and plan for that can be really helpful to us. Okay, so other people. So a quote from Carly: "Sensory-wise, shared accommodation made a huge negative impact on my mental and physical health." I think I mentioned this earlier. Nobody in this paper who contributed to this paper wanted to live with other people aside from their partners or immediate family. So there was a real aversion to shared accommodation. And not because the participants didn't like other people, but because it adds such social demands and adds such a lot of sensory input to living with other people, even if people are behaving just in a normal human way. The stuff I mentioned, the flushing toilets, the washing machine, the music, the phone ringing, the doorbell, moving around. All of those kind of very normal household noises can actually be really distressing. So what people said to us was, it really limits my choice and control for my sensory environment if I was needing to share with other people, or when I've had to share with other people, it's really dramatically negatively affected my mental health, and I would avoid it as far as possible. So people in the report, people also commented on the challenge of having shared spaces. So perhaps not feeling safe in the shared spaces, not knowing what the social or cultural expectations are in that space. So again, this speaks a little bit to autistic people often have a different culture and communication system. So, you know, we really need the implicit to be made explicit. So I talk about, you know, in a job I worked in, there was rules around when you brought your own tea and coffee and when you used the office tea and coffee, and if there was a biscuit on one side it meant you could eat it, but if food was on a different side it meant it belonged to somebody, but that wasn't written anywhere. So it's like there's all of this implied knowledge that people somehow know or pick up but isn't always made explicit. And so what we find sometimes in shared environments is that there is implicit expectations and social norms that can be really difficult for autistic people to be able to know. Like, you know, we don't always get the subtleties of neurotypical communication and really prefer it to be direct and clear so we know where we stand. Okay, so this is an image that Alexis Quinn shared with us as part of the report. So Alexis contributed a kind of personal story or case study to the report. And some of you will be familiar with Alexis from their work with the Restraint Reduction Network, and of course she's the author of the book Unbroken. And Alexis talked to us about her experience of being in hospital and then being discharged, and how important the sensory environment has been to Alexis. And I included this image because we really wanted to mention shutdown and meltdown. And Chris, in preparing for this, Chris and I were talking about our own experiences of shutdown yesterday. So when we're talking about shutdown, what we're really talking about is sensory and/or social overload. And that presents differently for different people, but essentially I tend to get shut down. So shut down, when it happens for me, I'll go quiet, I will withdraw, I will probably be staring into space. I often, like, my head gets really, really hot, and I probably, like, to the touch I feel really hot, but I also feel really cold. So if I can, I'll be like under a duvet or like wrapped up in a jumper and, you know, with the fire on, and I'll probably be crying, but I might be able to hold that back. And I can't talk, so I go non-verbal. I usually can't move, or I might be able to move like after about an hour and a half. So it's like my whole system just shuts down. I get overloaded and I shut down. And what happens for other people sometimes is that they go into meltdown. So I go into a kind of a freeze response, but other people might go into a fight or flight response, and that's where you might see people trying to run away or leave a building, or you know, perhaps if they're touched or come into contact with people, then, you know, they might kind of fight or punch or kick or scream to try and get away from this overload. So Chris and I were discussing this yesterday, and Chris will share his experience of sensory overload, but I was saying, you know, my overload really tends to be social. So I definitely can get overloaded from overwhelming sensory input, but I'm much more sensitive to social overload. So I can do pretty well in a professional role, like I know what's expected and I know how to deliver it. But if you put me in a social environment where I don't know what the rules are, or I don't know what's expected, or I don't know how I'm supposed to behave, or what I'm supposed to talk about, or what's acceptable, or I get really awkward, and I sometimes start to stammer, and I try and plan everything that I'm going to say, and try and work out if I've said the right things, and like it just creates so much input and so much anxiety, and it's so exhausting. You know, thinking about those brain scans earlier, like no wonder my brain is overheating. It's working so hard to try and communicate and connect and maintain these social norms. And when I get tipped into overload, like it's really physically painful. Like it's very, very uncomfortable. It really hurts, and I will go out of my way to avoid it. And I think what we see sometimes when people are struggling in their homes particularly in shared environments, particularly where their sensory needs haven't been met, particularly where there are a lot of social demands, is that people get overloaded and they go into fight or flight. And what happens for some of us is, and actually I think a lot of us is, once we've hit that threshold that takes us into shutdown or meltdown, actually we become much more sensitive. So unless we get time to really decompress and regulate, and for things to be okay for a little while, it doesn't take much to take us back into that, and we kind of get into this quite difficult cycle of being constantly overloaded and not able to regulate. And some of us will go to quite extreme lengths to try and regulate. So, you know, we might have things like favourite hobbies, or stimming, or moving, or verbal tics, or you know, a favourite thing that we might use to normally try and regulate us. And if that doesn't work, then, you know, when I get overwhelmed, I think, you know, what it feels like would help me is to hurt myself. Like, it feels like a really effective way to regulate myself, and I have enough of the things now that I don't need to do that anymore. But that's where we really see people having a difficult time, and it's often in this overwhelm that we see people being admitted to hospital. Chris, if I can pass over to you to talk a little bit about sensory overload.
Yeah, thanks. As Jill said, I kind of experienced the opposite side of this. I can be overloaded by sensory, but it's more common that it's going to be I can be overloaded by social, but it is more likely that I'm going to be overloaded by sensory. For me, it genuinely feels like my brain starts slowing down. It feels like I start dropping IQ points, and by the time I'm in fight or flight mode, I feel like I've lost 50 IQ. Like, I don't feel like I can engage in conversation at that point. I'm embarrassed by how I engage in conversation. It's very simplistic, and it can just be rough to try and converse with people because I just feel like an idiot, and it's a really painful feeling. It's also frustration based for me. I'm frustrated that I can't engage. I'm frustrated that this noise won't stop. I'm frustrated that I can't get away from it. And so if someone pressures me in that moment, that is where the fight or flight comes in. Personally, I'm a bit like Joe, I shut down, which is why both of us got away without being diagnosed when we were young, most likely. Because who cares if someone just goes quiet? It's when they lash out or run away that you get a real issue, and you get the diagnosis quite often. We're getting better at noticing people that shut down now, but yeah. When it comes to social situations, I actually fawn my way out. I talk my way out, as I mentioned earlier. And it's really peculiar because, as I say, I go basically non-verbal, apart from I have what I call panic talking. So I've almost prepared this beforehand, and I give a spiel about how I need to go and do something, and then I can leave. When I am in a sensory overload, it's, pain, anxiety, frustration. It presents for me like a migraine, but there's nothing I can take to stop it. So there's no possible way I can do anything to it. I can't focus on anything. I can't explain it to anyone very well. I'm basically left just waiting it out as I occasionally go and throw up. And unfortunately for me, with how extreme my sensory, you can't see me at the moment, but I'm sitting here in a pitch black room with noise cancelling headphones on underneath a cover that is, I've specially chosen Egyptian cotton and so on, just to try and limit my sensory input as much as possible so I can engage in this kind of work. If it goes badly enough for me, when I'm out in public, I'd say 30% chance I get a migraine every time I leave the house. Sometimes it's delayed. I often will, if it's especially for work, I will fight through it in the moment, but that can actually exacerbate what happens when I get home afterwards, and I can be out for a day or two after, maybe even longer. A full week is not outside the realm of possibility. The brain needs time to recover. Downtime is how an autistic person copes with the world. We need our downtime. We need the chance to download to someone, possibly. We need a chance to focus on our special interest. We need the chance to clear our roads in whatever way possible that is. It's as important as well-organised uptime is well-organised downtime, working out how you can recover and clear those roads. Because if you don't, when uptime comes along again, you don't have the room to deal with it. I've had days where I've had to say no to work because I just don't have the room to it. On that day, I've had to disappoint my colleagues and so on because I've had to say I can't do this to them, sorry, because I haven't prepared myself well enough. I haven't taken into account the journey or something like that. It's a lifelong experience of learning, and you can learn to deal with it. You can learn to cope with it to a certain extent, but those triggers are always there. So much of autism is about learning how to clear the roads. And as we've seen today, sensory, pretty gigantic part of it. So home, the important thing to realize, like I'm sure you're already picking this up today, it doesn't matter how nice the home is. It doesn't matter if everything's new or in fashion, or even like, I guess it does matter if it's clean. Clean's good. We like clean. But it's what works for the individual. We're looking for downtime. We're looking for somewhere so comfortable they can recover from the world. And that's the word I want to use, is recovery. We're looking for a space they can recover that doesn't have input randomly coming in. Jill mentioned earlier my constant fight against evil in the world that is heating and washing machines. I absolutely hate them. I hate the fact my family likes having clean clothes. It's unreasonable. I don't like it. Because what happens is that when that machine is on, it's like it's invading my space. I can't focus on anything else. I can't do anything else. I'm just aware of that noise. And so we have, like, obviously I sometimes allow them to clean their clothes and wash their clothes. So we kind of let each other know in advance when that's going to happen, so I can prepare to, say, be doing something else or be out of the house or something like that. It's something you really need to think about. And again, we have a quote here from Cos again, which is people design homes that are like a posh clinic. They think that autistic people need a home that you can clean with a J-cloth. I don't want that. I want a home that is calm and comfortable. Again, she's looking for somewhere she can be comfortable, that she can recover. It's that simple. So again, it's offering choices to people until they build the environment they're most comfortable with. Don't never assume that you can build something for someone that's perfect for them. It doesn't matter how amazing you are, they're the one that's going to know best. You just need to be able to give them the opportunity when they're processing to actually manage to build that. What you can build is a very good neutral environment they can then customize. It's what we recommend on nearly all of our sensory visits. It's basically impossible to build a perfect house for an autistic person. But what you can do is build one that's neutral. It doesn't add anything to their roads, and then they can add the stuff that's good and helps. So yeah, as I say, outdoor spaces. One of the worst contributors to overload I see is actually roads. And especially because for some reason people like building houses directly on main roads and care homes on main roads, easy access, I guess, things like that. But that noise, you can't get away from it. The older I've gotten, the more I've realized I can't ever sleep with my window open. I like cold air coming into my room at night. It refreshes me. I like sleeping with that. But I just can't handle the noise. I can't handle the cars going past. I can't handle the occasional drunk person walking home singing to Kylie Minogue. I don't know what they sing to, I don't know music, but singing to whatever they're singing to at night. Like whatever that is, it's just, it ruins my safe environment. So the location is important. It's, again, probably unlikely to find the perfect location, but the more remote, the more isolated, the more, I guess, the less input you can get from the outdoors. Wonderful. And if some people really enjoy an outdoor space, a garden. I know, for example, Jill, if she lived in a world where she wasn't allowed to go for walks with her dog, I don't know if we'd be seeing Jill here today. Like, it's utterly integral to her. I myself am a homebody. I think the outside world's evil and out to get me, but some people really do love it. And so garden space, very important. Got a quote here from Ruth about this exact subject. The garden recharges me. I can sit there or do some weeding or planting, listen to the birds, read under the trees. The curves and softness of the plants are soothing. Having space to escape to in the house means, again, the ability to decompress as well as places to recharge. So a lower arousal environment is key for both. Once again, she's not designing her garden. She's not designing her house for interest, for looks, for anything like that. She's designing it for low impact, a low arousal environment. And that is the key. Once again, it's just about the roads. It all comes back to roads. Whenever I give an autism training session, I end up saying the word roads 50 million times in reference to the brain, simply because it just all comes back to how many cars are people dealing with, what's going on, like how many IQ points have they dropped because there's a fan on, because the heating pipes are going. Do they have room to process because they've been dealing with the washing machine? It all comes down to that. So thinking about an outdoor space as, again, very important. Yeah, again, let them design it. Let them have some input into it if they really want that. Let them be a part of this decision. It really, really helps.
Sure. So this is kind of a bit of a summing up slide, really. We're coming to the end of the presentation. So Emma says, if my sensory environment is right, it's blissful. If it's not right, I feel stressed and it can provoke meltdown, anxiety and depression. And Ruth says, sensory overload to me is exhausting, so living in a low arousal environment is an essential part of maintaining good mental health and emotional regulation for me. Part of the solution is feeling safe. So, we've talked a lot about the different senses and the way that housing can be adapted, or sensory needs can be considered in housing. We absolutely believe that this is vital for autistic people, but the thing that has become clear in the course of our work is that actually it's also really beneficial to other people. A calm, neutral sensory environment is likely to be beneficial for anyone that's accessing the space. I'm just going to pick up on one of the questions that's come into the chat at this point. So the questions, and there's been a couple along a similar theme, but around how do we design a house or a living environment that's suitable for an autistic person when individual need varies so much? And I think it's a really good question, and it is one that comes up quite a lot in our conversations. Absolutely, everybody is different. I think that's true across the board, but particularly it's true for autistic people, where we all have individual sensory profiles and individual needs and wishes. The thing that we would really encourage is a neutral, low stimulus environment with as much choice and control within that as possible. So we'd go calm, neutral colours, we'd go quiet, we'd make it kind of pretty plain. So no kind of quirks or flourishes, you know, which architects tend to love, but can be really confusing and can add a lot of stimulus. So we'd go calm, neutral environment, choice and control. So, for example, with lighting, a lot of places just have a bright overhead light, but if we can have side lights or a good quality dimmer switch that doesn't hum, then it gives maximum user control. It tends to be easier to add in additional things than to remove it. So we'd start really simple, really calm, kind of pastel neutral colours, not a lot of visual input, so not a lot of paintings on the walls or that kind of thing. And then we would add from there and like tailor it to meet the individual need. I think that if we can do that, we will be getting it right for most people. So the key senses that I'd really consider is sound. So trying to make sure that it's quiet or that noise is predictable. And the other one is lighting. So really avoiding fluorescence is key. Having good quality LED installations and with user control, so not automatic. And there's also, I'm kind of slightly jumping ahead into questions, but there was a question around smell and someone wanting a little bit more information on that. So the really key thing I would say around smell is like if it's not possible for people to have choice and control, for example, like, you know, maybe around what detergent to use and that kind of thing, what washing up liquid to use and you know, what cleaning products to use, choice and control can be really helpful. But when that isn't possible, the stuff that can really help is making it predictable. So Chris mentioned in my previous house, I had some cleaners that came in once a fortnight and I knew when they were coming and I had an agreement with them, though they didn't always stick to it, around what cleaning stuff they were going to use. And so make it predictable, so I know on that day, actually, my house is going to smell a bit strange. I'm probably not going to want to be there. I'll probably want to kind of have the doors open. Make it possible for people to move away, so I would always go out with the dog at that time when they were there, when it was at the strongest. But also a masking smell can be really helpful. So a smell of my choice on a tissue or something like that I can use. So it is adding cars to the road, but at least it's cars of my choice rather than something that's either unexpected or is led by someone else. Yeah, so sensory needs are so important, and if we can if we can keep these in mind and consider them, then, you know, we will help people to flourish and to lead good lives. So if we can just go on to I think it's kind of our last slide. So some suggested next steps. Please, like, if it's been interesting, please have a look at the report. There's a lot more kind of recommendations and suggestions and more background information about what we've spoken about today. At the back of the report is a checklist, so have a look at that if you're reviewing a sensory environment, and ideally work with someone autistic in that. We literally have a different sensory experience, so it's really unlikely that neurotypical people will get this right for us because you're working on a different operating system. Ask questions about sensory needs. They're often not recognised. Autism, our understanding is still developing, and sensory needs are only just part of the diagnostic criteria. So if you're working with someone who's autistic and trying to get housing right for them, ask what are their sensory needs. Have they had a sensory assessment done? What are the things we really need to think about in terms of the sensory environment for this person? And plan for a calm and neutral environment and support. People are often the most unpredictable thing in any environment, and so getting the right team with the right approach is so important to getting the environment right. Thank you. Okay, so when these come out, there's some links there that you can access to the checklist, the LGA executive summary, the NDTI full report, and a CQC report that complements the work that we've done. And then the next slide, I think, is a shout out to the artists and other contributors. So we've had a ton of artists and other contributors who whose images we've used in this presentation, and yeah, do have a look at the rest of their work. And I think we're on to question and answers. So okay, so who would you approach for a sensory needs assessment? So I would approach an occupational therapist who is qualified to do that work. That's the official answer. It can also be really good to involve other autistic people. So perhaps alongside the OT, to have someone who shares those sensory needs and that sensory experience can be really beneficial for people. So I don't know a lot about stroke, but I guess that a stroke might alter someone's brain function and neurology. I guess a stroke potentially might also make somebody differently sensitive to their sensory environment, and or might mean that people need clearer or more explicit communication. So I'm generally not aware of similarities, but I think that the approach that we're advocating for calm, clear, neutral environment can actually be beneficial to a lot of people, regardless of their need.
That when it comes to the behaviours and so on that occur due to overload, it is very similar with realising to epilepsy and so on, which I think is another well-known brain condition / thing that happens. My brain's not really working with important words now, so forgive me. But I think we're realizing that a lot of things are interlinked on just basically being overloaded, like the road system shutting down or firing off in a place where it shouldn't be firing off, or like things like that. I think there's one thing I noticed earlier I would like to ask, which is can autism be diagnosed with a brain scan in all cases? Was asked. Answer to that is a complicated one, simply because what is autism? As far as we can tell, autism is now basically having a bit of a specialized brain, quite simply because there's no way to tell based on ability or even just affinity for things. So we've got some people amazing socially, some people are amazing at maths and so on. It's really difficult to tell. It's become a bit of an umbrella term for anyone that's not neurotypical and can't be diagnosed with anything else.
I think one of the really interesting things at the moment is that there is a mix of diagnostic criteria. So there isn't a single criteria for diagnosing autism. And I think that says a lot about our current understanding of autism and the diagnostic criteria. And I think autistic people are increasingly being seen and heard. Yeah, but it's evolving, and I think it lacks clarity.
A good question we had which is going back to noise. How can we support when it comes to hair clippers and dryers? Answer to that is, again, preparation, I think. Doing all you can to prepare the person for it and making it as low impact as possible. So if you as a supporter are quite hyped up and worried about it going in, obviously that might raise anxiety. If you're going in with a plan, you've worked on the plan, they've agreed on the plan, and you go in almost casually and being like, and give them a time limit, like it's no matter what, this is going to be taking 5 minutes, something like that. Like we know it's going to only take that long. It gives us something to strive for. It's like, right, cope for 5, cope for 5, cope for 5. Just be aware if you do that and then go to 6, or hell's going to break loose.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add is it needed? Like, you know, would something else do the job? You know, could the person grow their hair a bit longer? Could scissors be used instead? Is a dryer necessary? So I think we often can sit through something if we know how long, but it's like it's at what cost. So if I'm sitting through something for a certain amount of time, then it's going to take an enormous amount of energy and will for me to do that, and I'm going to need a break afterwards. So, you know, if I'm really set on wanting my hair, I find getting my hair cut socially very demanding, and it's pretty much my one activity for the day when it happens. But I do it because it feels important and the benefit pays off for me. I feel good about that. So I think it's about like thinking like, you know, is it worth it for this person? How can we make it tolerable if it is? Are there other adjustments that would help? And having the downtime afterwards, I think that opportunity to relax and have a break can be really helpful. We had a question around mental health inpatient services. So I'd point you to the Not Rocket Science report. That's on the NDTI website, and that was a report that is specifically around things that inpatient services need to consider. That is like targeted around CAMHS, but actually that was just because it was commissioned by CAMHS and involved children and young people in that participatory way. But I would say that the learning can be applied all age. Yeah, so that's the report I'd look to for that, and there's a free online session as well on the NDTI website on that.
Yeah, we've got one. I don't know if it's a question such, but from Stella, which is her son is autistic and speaks very loud and doesn't realise this. Conversely, he cannot cope with loud noises that are unpredictable and has had to do things like get off public transport in a risky area because he can't stay on there any longer. He wears noise cancelling headphones, but that can disconnect him socially. I think you've just described, or I've just described my life reading out your question. I've had to do that exact thing and leave the situation many a time. I'm always in noise cancelling headphones. What I will say is it's rather than looking at just the noise, you want to look at what else is going on. If you've already taken every step you can to reduce noise, it's worth looking at, is there a lesser issue you can also remove? So, for example, if out of 100, he's getting 70% of it is noise that's overloading him, what about that last 30%? Is there anything you can do with clothes? Is there anything you can do with preparation? Is there anything you can do with smell or something like that? And then try and reduce it in different ways to give him a bit more room to process. Hyper-focusing on one sense is a bit of an issue. Like when I first got diagnosed and realised sensory issues were a thing, my first focus was actually on light. So I wore sunglasses everywhere, but I didn't even think for about 3 or 4 years about wearing headphones, which is a huge mistake, because it turns out noise is worse for me than light. So I kind of scuppered myself there because I didn't think about it. I didn't consider the other options. So yeah, think about all the different things, even if it's a small thing. If you can reduce like by 5%, 2%, 1%, it's still worth it, basically.
Thanks, Chris. We've had a question from Tracy around who was involved in this paper. So it's a really interesting question. We had a range of people involved, and we went out to people and we invited people to take part in whatever way they wanted. So we invited people to take part like verbally, so it was in COVID, but to meet with us online and to have a conversation, or to have a phone conversation, or to send us their views written format, or to send us artwork, or to contribute in whatever way they wanted. So we really tried to approach this being mindful of the fact that that not everybody uses verbal communication, and not everybody feels comfortable or confident in conversation with another person. And we tried to set out the questions and the intent, and also to provide support afterwards. We had a range of contributors, so we didn't hear from anyone who is in hospital at the moment, because the focus was very much on housing, though for our other report we only heard from people who've been in a hospital setting. And we had contributors we didn't have anyone who was in residential support, but we did have people who were in supported accommodation and living independently, but also from people who'd lived in a mix of environments, so both shared accommodation, supported living, and in their own homes, either as tenants or owners. So yeah, we really tried to hear from a mix of people. I think this kind of links a little bit to a question around working with people who have learning disability and or who don't use verbal communication. Of course, we want to involve people and we want to consider people's communication, and you know, I'm sure you're all aware, like, people tend to communicate even if they can't use verbal communication. So you know, we'll I think there's over 90% of our communication is through body language and that kind of thing anyway. So it's like, how do we hear what people are showing us and telling us, even if they're not telling us verbally? And I also think there's tremendous value in working with autistic people who do use verbal communication. And a lot of the work that my team does is kind of as a translation service. And you know, Chris is you know, one of the team who leads a lot of this work. And that's really about us spending time with people and working alongside people to understand what their sensory and social needs are, so that we can actually translate that for the team and the people working with them. Because often it's really, really clear to other autistic people, because we identify with that person's experience and communication, and actually it's that it hasn't really been seen or heard by the neurotypical team who might be working with them, you know, and not because they're not trying or that it's not well intended, but they haven't got those skills or they're working from a different operating system. So I think it's really about like bringing in the expertise and working with autistic people to kind of provide that translation and support so that we can hear and learn about autistic communication.
I've got a nice thing here from Sharon, which is saying basically it's about a lot of the sensory work is about personalizing it, making it personalized care, and also that Jill's voice is very soothing, and I agree. There's one question which is from a housing point of view, how can we help anyone who is autistic, as there seems to be a varied aspects to it, and one property cannot meet the needs of all the service users. With shortfall of appropriate housing, it's almost impossible to meet the needs. How do we address this? I think the answer to that, at least from me, is you do the best you can. Obviously, there's going to be restrictions. There's going to be some ways that you can't do things. You do everything you can to prepare, and you do your best to let them at least have a personal space that is as perfect for them as they can make it. You might not be able to put. You obviously can't change where the house is located, you probably can't change the fact sometimes that they're going to have different housemates inside. But you can put in things such as noise cancelling panels, different doors that cancel out more noise. You could break up the space. You could try and have certain rules in the house for behavior and noise and so on, things like that. You work within the limitations you're given. Sometimes it's not going to be enough, and people are going to really struggle. But often just the awareness that there are those issues makes a pretty huge difference in adapting to the individual, basically. As long as you're not expecting them to adapt to the environment, which is a very common thing and just never really works. As long as you can hopefully adapt the environment enough for them to survive, they will build it up into something they can cope with, hopefully, while you search for something more appropriate. I don't know if Jill's got anything else on that.
Yeah, so the other thing I'd add to that, and we haven't touched on it a lot in this presentation, but there is more on it in the report. So we've really focused around changes that can be made to the built environment in this presentation, but you know, there is a lot of things that we can do to support people to manage themselves. So Chris has spoken about noise cancelling headphones. Sunglasses can really help. Like caps can really help. Like, they cut out a lot of glare, but also minimise the visual intrusion. So they can act kind of like blinkers, which can be really helpful. So there's adjustments that can be made that can support the person to manage their input, even when we can't control or change the environment. The other thing that I think can be really, really helpful is to make it predictable. So if I know, for example, if my neighbours were going to do building work and they told me what was happening, when it was happening, how long it was going to last, I would find it a lot easier to tolerate if I had that full information and knew what to expect. So I think it's also about making it really explicit and clear and supporting people to have a choice. So for example, if my neighbours are doing building work, then I might make a plan that I can be somewhere else. So if it becomes too much, I've got a choice to move. And in having that choice, it makes it more likely that I'll be able to tolerate sitting through it. So I think you know, a lot of it is about how we approach it and what information and support we give to people as well. Has there been any research done on products in new build homes, which are good for people who experience sensory overload but also meet sustainability criteria, etc.? Rachel, I'm not aware that there has been any research. I think there's a real lack of research. So what we're seeing at the moment, which kind of is a good thing, is a real focus on sustainability and carbon emissions and that kind of thing. And, you know, particularly in lighting, we're seeing this, but also, you know, across the sector with heat pumps and that kind of thing. I think what we're seeing is a focus on sustainability and emissions at a cost of other impacts. I'm not aware of any research, but this is being looked at as part of I think the PAS touches on this. So this is something that British Standards Institute have got out at the moment. It's something that we're talking to those who, the team who are writing the health building notes around inpatient services. Yeah, but I'm so delighted that you're asking this question, and you know, I wonder if you know, how we kind of bring the learning together. So we're talking with quite a few different kind of architects teams and environments teams and estates teams. Yeah, so I'm sure there's kind of an interested group that we might be able to bring together and kind of share some learning. Yeah, so maybe if you would be happy to email me, we might be able to think about how we join up and share what we're learning and what works and what doesn't work. Okay, so a question from someone about how to engage and co-produce. So my best suggestion on this is employ an autistic person as an advisor. So that's how we work when we're co-producing, is from the beginning we get an autistic advisor and they work with us to advise on what are we asking the right questions, how do we get our approach right, how do we get our payments right, what information and support do we need to provide to people, what format do we need to do it in, how do we do it in an autism informed way and in a way that's really accessible and will help us to reach the right people in the right way. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of hints and tips around kind of how to make it accessible and engaging, but I'd really advocate getting an autistic person as an advisor and working alongside you on that.
Can family do more to support their loved ones? As when dealing with to support their loved ones when dealing with some cases, it's more of a housing issue than anything else. I think that goes down to the personal side of things. Jill was mentioning a few moments ago, working on everything that you can do for the individual rather than the environment. So headphones, even things like there's chewies, like chew toys, there's fiddle stuff. Like I've just ordered a few more tangles, the fiddly finger stuff, because I like having my fingers doing something. There's lots of things like that, and also just supporting, understanding, research, looking into things so they can engage. One of the best coping mechanisms in the world for an autistic person, I firmly believe this, is having someone to download to, having someone you can talk to about your special interest, about your day, about anything. It's the way to clear the roads. My family lives for downloading each other in the evenings. Like it's the only way we cope with our lives half the time is that we go downstairs and whoever's had the worst day tends to download at the other ones. And then we kind of move it back and forward after that point. Like it's just a thing that happens. It's our equivalent of going to the pub and having a drink with friends. So if family can offer that, family can actually care about that, and that's a huge way of doing things.
Very good. Thanks so much, Chris. So I think we're at time. So thanks again to Andrew for starting us off and for working with us on this. Thanks again to the LGA for hosting. Chris, thanks so much for your time and expertise and storytelling. Do have a look at the links and yeah, we'll share the presentation with all of that information and links to the references that we've made. Very good. There's also going to be a feedback survey sent out, so if you're willing to complete that, we'd really be very grateful. All right, very good. Rachel, any more from you?
Well, just to say a massive thank you to Chris, Andrew and to Jill for a really fantastic presentation, and to everybody who helped organise it. I think it's a really, great presentation, great report. There were lots in there for everybody. and we will circulate a link to the report, a link to give you the PowerPoint. We'll be putting it up on the website as well, because we've got a recording of this, and we will answer all the questions fully. So, but thank you to everybody for their time, and I hope you have a really good afternoon.